Okay, so we are going to be talking about this is kind of in preparation for the first assignment, so something familiar. Um, we're going to be, for this assignment, using, we're going to set our image quality on our camera to JPEG. If you already understand how RAW works, by all means use it, but we don't necessarily need it yet. The most important thing I want us to do for this assignment is to take pictures, to get us going, to get us warmed up to taking photographs, because that's the most important thing. We're going to get to editing in Photoshop not too long from now, but right now what I want is for you to be able to take photographs with your camera, upload them to your computer, and then share them with us. So I want you to set the image quality to JPEG, and we're going to be using P mode, and that's program. So program is a semi-auto setting, and what's great about it is we can choose our ISO, but it's going to choose our aperture and our shutter speed for us. Those three things are crucial to the proper exposure of our images, and there's a balance with all of them, and you're going to start to learn what you want to prioritize because they change the way that the image actually looks. We'll get into that later, and we're going to learn a lot about those things actually by this first assignment in noticing how the image actually looks based on certain settings like the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO. So this is the exposure triangle, and this is boring, but it helps. Most importantly, it gives kind of a description on here of what the different, of what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO actually do. So we're going to start with ISO because this is what you're going to be focusing on, or should I say, this is the setting that you have to worry about for this first assignment, but you don't actually have to focus on anything too much because we're going into P mode, which is partially auto. So again, like I said, so we can just focus on taking a photograph and framing the world between the frame. So down here we see ISO, and we see 100, 200, 400, 800. There's a pattern. They're doubling, right? So 100, as we can see down here, we have a crispy, clean bicycle. And as it gets higher, it becomes grainy. So in the film days, we called it grain, and in the digital days, we call it noise. They both kind of tell us the same thing, that as the ISO is getting higher, the image is kind of starting to become a little less grounded and is going to be a little, it could be a little soft, and it could be pixely, it could be noisy, colors might start to change in the shadows or the highlights. We might start to see haloing of colors around certain objects or parts of the image. And typically, we try to keep our ISO as low as possible because that makes our image as smooth as possible. And once we start editing images, we realize that the lower the ISO, the better quality the image is and the easier they are to work on. The thing is, sometimes we end up in darker places and we need to bring our ISO up. So as we can see right above the numbers here, it says brighter. So as the ISO goes up, the camera gets more sensitive and makes it so that we can make darker images brighter. So if it's broad daylight, we actually kind of call this daylight. 100, back in the film days, again, they had, they would refer to like daylight film. That meant that you were using a film that was meant for not only the brightness of daylight, but the white balance of the sun. So here we have ISO 100, broad daylight. 200 and 400, maybe it's foggy or cloudy, or it's, there's a lot of light, but it's not quite as bright as daylight. 800 and 1600, you're getting into the shade, you're getting into the evening or the early morning. 3200, 6400, you're getting into, real dark. It's real dark. And at this point, it's like you're really embracing that grain, or get a tripod. because if we get a tripod, we can use a slower shutter speed to accommodate, but more on that later. What I want you to do now is, when you're doing this assignment, is pay attention to whether or not you're in a bright scene or you're in the dark, and you can play around with different ISOs. So one sign that's going to tell you that you might have an ISO that's too slow for your brightness, maybe it's kind of dark but you're still set to ISO 100, is you're going to start to see motion blur. And you're going to see motion blur possibly because it's too dark and the shutter speed is having to go a lot longer to let in the amount of light to get the right exposure. Okay? So if you look up here, we've got 1/8 of a second, and down here we have 1/1000th of a second. Everything in between. Just like ISO, everything cuts in half. To make our lives easier, they went from a 60th to a 30th to a 15th, and a 15th to an 8th. 1/8 would actually be 1/16th, but they made it easy for us, right? So these are basically doubling, and as you can see, we've got blurry at 1/8 and we've got sharp at 1/1000th. You're going to be in P mode. P mode means that your shutter speed and aperture are going to be chosen by the camera just to get you an exposure that's correct. So if you're taking a photograph and you start to see motion blur, maybe you're photographing a kid running, a niece or a family member, or you're photographing cars, or there's some movement, action, sports. Not much sports happening these days, but you know what I mean. If there's action, you're probably going to want a faster shutter speed so that you can actually freeze the thing that's happening. If you have a slow shutter speed, everything's going to be blurry and all over the place. Okay? So that's what you'll need to pay attention to. If you're photographing in P mode and you're starting to see motion blur and you don't want it, all you're going to have to do is change your ISO to the next highest number, maybe take another picture. That's the beauty of digital. We can take a picture, look at it. Are our settings correct? Why is it looking blurry? Bring your ISO up. Or in the other case, you could just, if you're in broad daylight and your ISO is too high and everything's super frozen, and you notice when you hit the playback, or if you are paying attention in your viewfinder to what your shutter speed's actually going to, it can go higher than this. If it's going to 1/2000th of a second, you're not photographing hummingbirds, are you? Maybe you are? Okay, if you're photographing a hummingbird, you're going to want a really fast shutter speed to be able to get the wings frozen, right? But if it is that high and it doesn't need to be, like you're making a portrait, you can make a portrait with 1/25th of a second, right? They're not moving, they're just standing there. So if your ISO is up super high, you can maybe bring it down. You're just going to want to pay attention to it. Again, the exposure triangle is super boring compared to actually learning from taking pictures. Aperture is the diaphragm within the lens. It opens and it closes. That's the aperture. It's how our eyes work, and it's just we let in different amounts of light. So what you're going to learn later on is that our apertures affect depth of field, and we don't need to worry about that right now. Some of you might learn about depth of field through this first assignment, but the most important thing that I want you to pay attention to is ISO, and the thing that you'll probably care the most about is whether or not there's motion blur. Because a lot of people take pictures and they're like, it's blurry, why is it blurry? Why is everybody moving around so much? It's your shutter speed. You'll maybe start to realize that you have to take pictures at a minimum 1/250th of a second to get that frozen quality that you like. So you got to pay attention to that. Okay. So again, just to recap, for this assignment, you have the image quality. Set it to JPEG. We're going to make our lives easy. We're going to get into RAW later. We'll talk about why. Make sure that you are set to P mode, and with that you'll want to know what your ISO is. You're not going to be controlling aperture and shutter speed, so all you need to pay attention to is whether or not your ISO is helping those other things get to the right amount of motion and everything that you want. Other than that, that's basically it. I want you to get your cameras, have your manuals, play with the pictures, take photographs of whatever. Don't say maybe, say yes. Take the picture, decide whether it was good or not later. And email me if you have any questions.